From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Don Schiffman. Thousands of children across the state, from newborns through age 17, are in the foster care system. The Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, or DCF, works to help families deal with problems and stay together ultimately. But in some instances of abuse and neglect, children must be removed from the home for their safety. Now, according to a report from the DCF in 2019, the number of children in foster care had risen sharply as a result of the opioid crisis. Well, today on 22 News in Focus, we're going to address how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted children and what's being done now to provide support and services to children at risk for abuse and neglect. So joining me now is Cassandra Hildreth, the Assistant Program Director for CASA Hampden County, also known as the Court-Appointed Special Advocates. I want to thank you for coming on the program. Let's first start with CASA. When and why was it founded?
Thanks for having us on. We're excited to be able to talk about CASA tonight. CASA is a program that's been around nationally since the 70s. So in Seattle, in 1976, a sitting judge by the name of David Sokup had a case before him with a 3-year-old child and a critical decision to make for that child, but found that he didn't have enough information and enough objective information to make that decision. Out of frustration for that situation was born the model where we could utilize community volunteers who are trained and who are skilled and dedicated to be a consistent source of information for the courts. The program came here to Hampden County, Massachusetts in the late 80s by our local judge, now retired, Judge Crampton Kamukala, who embraced this model as a way that could improve the court's ability to serve the best interest of children.
And overall, what is your mission?
So our overreaching mission, like all CASAs nationwide, there are 950 national CASA programs throughout the country. And each program has a mission of seeing permanency served for kids in foster care as quickly as possible, but also with respect to their time in the system. We want to make sure that their needs are met, that they're getting the services that they ought to get, and that they have the ability to thrive and have a sense of normalcy while they're in the system.
And what are some of the services that you provide?
So the program itself, the CASA program, the staff recruit community volunteers, screen volunteers, and provide intense training so that people from all walks of life can provide advocacy within the court system. It's a very unique position as you have non-system people who are invited into the court process. Our advocates with that training move forward and they are appointed to an abused or neglected child. And they stay with that child for the lifetime of the case, staying in touch with everybody who is important in that child's life and being a consistent source of information to the court, but also a consistent face and healthy relationship for the child during their time in the system.
Who are your volunteers and how many do you have now currently?
Sure. So our volunteers they're just amazing people is who they are, but they come from all walks of life. We have social workers, we have retired teachers, we have stay-at-home parents or people who've had some interface with the foster care system before. And we even have people who have had no connection to the child welfare system, but just a desire to help and to be a voice for a child.
And now what about funding? Where does funding come from?
So CASA of Hampden County is lucky enough to be seated within CHD, Center for Human Development. This is a large human service organization in Western Mass and Connecticut that has a long and strong history of providing services to the community. CHD holds a contract with the local Hampden County courts in Springfield and in Holyoke, and they receive state funding in order to keep CASAs working in the court systems. We also, because state funding can be tenuous, especially during these times, do seek out personal donations to support the program.
And how many children are involved with your program in Hampden County?
Yeah, so over the last 12 months, we have served 47 children through the Hampden County Juvenile Courts in Holyoke and Springfield.
And how do they come to your attention?
The judges refer children directly to the program. We have a limited number of volunteers for the number of children in need. We're serving about 10% of the capacity of the children in need with care and protection cases in Hampden County. So judges choose cases that they feel a CASA could be instrumental on and put in a referral for appointment to an advocate.
And then you mentioned the volunteer. So how many children are assigned to one single volunteer?
Our model is really for there to be one advocate to one case. A case may have a sibling set, so there may be a few children that volunteer is working with, but we really want to be able to be sure that we're providing child-focused and consistent contact. So children in the system often have frequent changes in foster homes or social workers or schools, and we want this to be one person who's connected to this child the whole time and has all of their time and energy to focus on that child.
And you say that's the hope that you have, one-to-one. But say, for example, you have maybe siblings. Would the two kids, for example, maybe have one volunteer that would work with both of them?
Absolutely. If that's what makes sense for the children, we're happy to provide one advocate for a set of siblings. For instance, we have an advocate now who is working with a family of 6 children. That's a lot of advocacy, but it makes sense for the family that they have this one continuous person who is invested, in the children's welfare. On the other hand, sometimes we have children with very separate needs in the same home, very different ages or different personalities, and at times it makes sense to provide each of them a separate advocate, even though they're part of the same case.
All right, once we return here, we're going to be discussing what impact COVID-19, the pandemic, is having on at-risk children. You're watching 22 News in Focus. We're back here now, 22 News in Focus, and today we're talking about the CASA, or Court-Appointed Special Advocates Program, that advocates for children being placed into foster care or needing permanent homes. Our guest is Cassandra Hildreth, the Assistant Program Director for CASA Hampden County. So the pandemic, the crisis, has created stress for all of us, but children and youth at risk for abuse and neglect are facing extreme social, emotional, and physical effects, and they're not being physically seen by mandated abuse reporters, such as, teachers, school nurses, coaches, counselors, even extended family and friends and neighbors. They're not seeing children. So what are you hearing from your volunteers, your colleagues, in regards to the concerns about children's welfare right now because of the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really salient point. Across the board, our CASA volunteers, those in the system we work with, our foster parents, even the court personnel, there's this consensus that we're living in an extremely high risk and frankly dangerous time as it relates to child welfare right now. There's just a perfect storm of increased stresses for all children and families, but especially children and families who have experienced trauma or are struggling. And there's a reduced access to service within the system. Those services that do exist are compromised in their quality. So there's great concern for children who are at risk of abuse, not having the eyes and ears on them that they ought to, as you mentioned, in school or even by their neighbors. There's great concern for parents and children whose efforts at reunifying and have an ongoing case in court have stalled cases and are not able to reunify because of canceled court dates and lack of opportunity to demonstrate their progress. And there is a concern for the prospects of a family who comes in at this point with borderline functioning, maybe because of substance abuse or mental health, being able to make the progress they need to in a good amount of time when they don't have the services available to them. Additionally, we've seen a great attrition rate of workers in the system who have been affected by the pandemic. And we have never had an influx of trauma-informed therapists, trauma-informed foster care workers, and have never had too many CASAs. So at a time where those numbers are going down, there's a lot of concern.
Yeah, those lines of defense being compromised right now because of the pandemic. Is CASA currently able to monitor children in person?
So we are respecting the families and the volunteers' obviously need for safety. Our contacts have been primarily virtual over the past year. We have a few instances where we've been able to negotiate safe visits at a social distance for CASAs and their appointed children.
And have you accepted new cases in the past year or seen an increase compared to years past?
We are taking new cases, and we just graduated a new class of CASAs and have been able to fill some waiting list cases. We have not seen an increase, but we would expect as things open up again and those mandated reporters again have contact with children, that there may be an influx of cases filed.
So when, for example, when we see kids going back to school, you're likely going to see an increase.
Yeah, we would expect that there would be, more concerns noted, more mandated reporters reporting, and that the referrals could get pretty steady.
Well, let's talk about protocols for intervention during a pandemic. What are they?
So our protocols for our program are standard to what you see in the community. We are limiting face-to-face visits at this time, although with immunizations now an option, that's starting to change. But the expectations of our advocates are the same. They still must have regular contact with their child, regular contact with all the collaterals, and they must submit court reports for every hearing that is going on. This is essential as families don't have access to all service providers during this time, or to DCF or the courts during this time. So CASA is unique in being able to continue that work throughout the year of the pandemic. Yeah,
and you just touched that too, because CASA works through the court system, which has been closed or limited access. How are you presenting cases now?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's a real concern that people's cases are completely stalled. So the courts have been closed to the public. They are open for limited emergency hearings. When those happen, CASA is a part of those hearings by Zoom with parents, with DCF workers, with attorneys. In between, we are submitting regular reports and updates to the court on every child that we serve. When the pandemic started, we didn't know if it would be 2 months or a year, as we are now. And being continuous about those reports means that there is an unbroken record in the court of a child's progress and circumstances, which will be very important in making future decisions.
Now, national figures have found that drug and alcohol use among teens and juvenile arrests and incarceration rates, those are actually down. So what issues are you seeing with youth in our area?
Oh, that's interesting. About 1/3 of our children served are younger teens, 15 to 18, and we certainly have a lot of contact through sister programs with youth. I do not think that there is a decrease in reality in those behaviors or in that lead to incarceration, but we do see that there is not as much ability to arrest and hold youth because of the pandemic. It is difficult to have kids in congregate care. And that translates also to treatment options. So it's underreported that kids are using drugs and alcohol. There simply is not the traffic in and out of those programs because of concerns around the pandemic. I would say that they're probably more underreported and underaddressed, but still there. One of the trends that we have definitely seen over the last year is that there is an increase in youth homelessness. And that definitely relates to the fact that those contributing risk factors are still prevalent.
Is there something that you guys can do? I mean, because I just see this kind of snowballing. And when we get to the other side of this pandemic and everything gets back to quote unquote normal, there's going to be this huge influx, it seems, of issues that we see arising, I suppose. Are you preparing for that?
We are. So we're recruiting now for a training class in May. We know that we're going to need more numbers. We are in the process of beginning to hire for another advocate supervisor, which will allow us to increase our children served by 25 cases. So we are expecting that, and we are working to get over the next few months new advocates trained and available to the court.
All right, and to that point, after the break, we're going to find out how you can get involved with CASA. You're watching 22 News in Focus. #22 News in Focus, and today we're discussing the CASA, or Court-Appointed Special Advocates Program, that advocates for children being placed in foster care or needing permanent homes. Our guest is Cassandra Hildreth, the Assistant Program Director for CASA Hampden County. Now, CASA depends on trained volunteers who are appointed by a juvenile court judge to advocate for an abused or neglected child's best interests. So I guess my question right now is, how does someone apply to be a volunteer?
So the first steps would be to attend one of our information sessions. This is a heavy lift volunteer experience. We want people from all different walks of life, but we want you to understand the importance and the weight of the role as well. Our information sessions are held on Saturday mornings. You can register for them at the CHD website. The easiest way to find us is chd.org/CASA, or to call 781 CASA to get more information. And from the information session, you can move on to deciding whether or not CASA is a good fit for you, and we would schedule a one-on-one interview.
And what are some of the requirements to become a volunteer?
All volunteers have to be 21 years or older. There is no specific qualification for employment or experience, but we do encourage people with transferable skills to apply. So anybody who's had work doing social work or clinical work or teaching or working in the health field, or somebody who has been a foster parent. There are references that need to be provided and core background checks that need to be performed.
And yeah, that was what I was going to ask next, the background checks. What does that entail?
The screening process includes you submitting 3 references. Includes you submitting a release for us to run Corey and Sori background checks, and also includes a 1.5 hour interview with CASA staff.
And then what specific work is necessary? Like what are you asking of these volunteers specifically?
We will keep volunteers busy. You will be learning everything that you can about that child, requesting records, reviewing their history, meeting everybody involved in their life, and setting up interviews with that child, not only at that referral point, but ongoing throughout the case. You want to stay updated with the teachers, with the therapists, with the health providers, with the parents of that child to see what the circumstances are and what kind of progress the family is making towards reunification. You'll be collaborating with providers in the court systems and in the social welfare systems to make sure that the child's needs are being met during their time in the system. And then ultimately, you'll be taking all of that information and providing reports to the judge overseeing the case and recommendations. So you'll be the best interest voice for that child in the courtroom about what they may need for permanency, for placement, for services, or even perhaps just visitation with their siblings.
Now, do people that sign up for this, is there a path to adoption for some of these families?
So we see kids reach permanency through reunification most of the time. We have the guiding philosophy that children grow up best in their families of origin whenever it is safe. When it's not safe, then yes, permanency comes through outside options like adoption through a family member or a kinship relationship, or just an adoptive family who's looking to provide a home for a child.
Now, once someone is accepted, what kind of training is there, and is there ongoing training?
There is ongoing training, and the initial training is substantial. It's 30 hours. It's done over a period of 6 weeks. Our next training will begin in May, and it will be half online and half in person, with those in-person sessions occurring on Saturday mornings. The training curriculum is broad about the child welfare system and issues that you may encounter when advocating for children. Additionally, we always have ongoing training for our volunteers to keep their skills on par. They're required to do at least 12 hours a year of ongoing training.
And then who supervises the advocates?
So we have advocate supervisors who are staff for the program, and they not only supervise, but really just provide support to the advocates. The advocates own their case. They do the work, but we're there to help guide you through a system that might be new to you, and help support you in times where you might not be able to make it to a court hearing or a school meeting, and be able to fill in those gaps for you.
And are you looking for volunteers now?
We absolutely are. We would like to double our current roster, so we're hoping to bring on 25 volunteers over the course of this calendar year.
What is your biggest concern right now? It's been a year of this pandemic, and there's still more to go. There's still more separation. We're still going to continue doing our Skype and Zoom interviews like we're doing right now. What is your biggest concern right now?
I think our biggest concern is that the consequences of this past year are still going to be unfolding for the next year and the year later. We have kids who've had an educational gap of over a year. We have families who have not been able to participate in their sobriety services or their mental health services. So it's going to take all hands on deck to make sure that the best interest of children are served over the next couple of years, and that families have a hope of being intact and that children can maintain and achieve permanency.
And I know we've been talking a lot about the stress that children are enduring throughout this pandemic, but what are you hearing from your volunteers? It's got to be stressful for them too right now.
It is not lost on me that they have chosen to volunteer during a pandemic, especially our most recent class. They're putting themselves out there at a time of great personal stress. And it just shows the fortitude of the kind of people who come to be a voice for a child. They are struggling. It is difficult. They rely a lot on peer support as well. This year, we started a book club for our CASA volunteers, which gives a connection point for them to other volunteers doing the same work.
And what other ways can someone help out?
If people want to help with CASA but aren't able to volunteer at this time, we could always use help with recruitment. So we do take volunteers to do that specific task. And I mentioned the ongoing training. If you're a person who has a skill set that would be usable for a volunteer or something that they could be trained in, we always are looking for people to come in and train our volunteers as well.
All right, we'll wrap things up once we return. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about the CASA, or Court-Appointed Special Advocates program, that advocates for children being placed in foster care or needing permanent homes. We learned a lot, and we're hoping that this entices you to become a volunteer in some form or fashion. I want to thank our guest. Thank you to Cassandra Hildreth, who is the Assistant Program Director for CASA Hampden County. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.
I want to thank you at home for watching. And if you missed this program, you can watch it in its entirety at our website right now at wwlp.com. From all of us here, have a good day.